So one of the clouds is still kind of hanging over you, I think, Brett. When I mentioned that we're going to have you on for an AMA, one of the first things one of my friends said was, "Oh, tell that guy to go right for the raising the price of that medication." And I explained, I think it's a lot more complicated than that, but I feel like you do a much better job of explaining the price hike and why it was justified, why it made sense than I did then. So if you can get into that a little bit, that'd be really helpful.
There's a direct correlation between how little you know about medicine and pharmaceuticals and how angry this situation makes you. And there's a bit of a logical fallacy there, but that's kind of not where I'm going. So stay with me for a second. That if you don't understand pharma and you don't know how pharma works, you end up getting really mad about this. And of course, you might say immediately the reaction is, well, just because it happens a lot doesn't mean that we don't have a right to get angry over it. And that's a good point. And I'll go through why one shouldn't be angry over this. But the first thing to understand is most people who get mad about this don't understand pharma at all. Because I often get this reaction of like, well, if you raise the price so much, how can people afford it? And of course, when you're given a number X and then you're told the price of something goes up by 50X, right? The new price is 50 times X, but I didn't tell you what the old price was. And the problem is that most people know that, for instance, it went from 13 to 750. So 50 times 750 is a big number, and that's a big number. How can anybody afford that? But I've been in pharma since I mentioned I was, at least on the Wall Street side, since I was a kid. And one of the things that isn't well understood is there are drugs that cost $250,000 or $300,000 or even $1 million a year. And those are fairly routine. So Daraprim is about $50,000, which makes it kind of a middle price drug. It's not even a high price drug in my opinion. And you only have to take it once because it works a little like an antibiotic. It just kills the parasite that's killing you. And so it's a life-saving drug. It's an important drug. But it's $50,000, whereas there are drugs that some of which I've kind of been behind these companies or an investor of these companies, but there's dozens of drugs that are several $100,000 a year, and people don't get mad at that. I asked one professor who was mad at me at some university lecture. He said, "How do you expect people to afford that?" I said, "Well, I don't see you protesting 𝗙𝗟𝗟𝗟, which is $600,000 a year for the rest of your life, mind you. So just 10 years on that drug." Which, people are going to need that drug even longer than that. Just 10 years on that drug is $6 million for the drug company. That makes Daraprim look like a drop in the bucket, and it is a drop in the bucket. It's an irrelevant drug. Only a few hundred people even need Daraprim every year. So, the idea that anybody would be mad about this, that it would, especially from a personal perspective, is outrageous, right? There's no need to be upset about this personally. Is it a theoretical question of concern? Sure. And we can talk about that. But for one person to be upset about this, I mean, the odds that you'll ever meet somebody that ever needs this drug are extremely small. And again, if you're not being mad at the company that made that $600,000 drug, it's called 𝗙𝗟𝗟𝗟. If you're not protesting 𝗙𝗟𝗟𝗟, why are you protesting me? Drugs are expensive. That's sort of something that we'll talk about in a minute, but that's sort of the nature of the beast. Now, again, you could say, well, drugs are expensive, sure, but they don't go from a small price to a large price overnight very often. Well, actually, they often will. And what ends up happening is you have drugs that are old that don't have their price increased every year because if a company has a merger or whatever happens. There are some drugs that have the price of a really old price, say from the 60s or 70s, and then they have their price changed to make it a more normal price. And you might say, well, why would you do that? Why raise the price indiscriminately for no reason? Well, there is a reason. Drugs need to have some kind of profit motive for somebody to make them. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, gee, I think I might start a factory and make penicillin today. Especially if you know how drugs are made. They're not just like two chemists sitting in a vat and mixing something up. You actually have to do something called CGMP, which is Current Good Manufacturing Protocols. And that sounds simple, but it's actually really difficult. It costs millions of dollars to comply with CGMP and FDA regulations, including their inspections and things like that. So even making a drug, really any drug on planet Earth, requires at least a couple $1 million. So if your drug's only selling a couple $1 million, you have zero incentive to make it. Now that's not good news if you're the patient that needs that drug to survive. And in fact, I've taken drugs before that one big drug company called 𝗙𝗟𝗟𝗟 decided they were going to stop making a gallstone drug. And they decided to do that because there was a better gallstone drug out there and their business went down a lot. So that makes sense, right? Okay, people can just use the new gallstone drug. But what they didn't realize is their gallstone drug was also a cure for a really rare genetic disease called CTX, 𝗙𝗓𝗏𝗡𝗏𝗡𝗃𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 Solvay didn't know that CTX even existed. So Solvay said, you know what, as of this date, the gallstones drug is discontinued. So if you had CTX, you're now been sentenced to death because a big drug company doesn't realize you exist and they don't care about you. It's 60 people, it's $1,000 a year. It doesn't even come close to making enough money to bear making. Guess who ended up buying that drug? Yes, yours truly. And if you know what happened, I raised the price of the drug quite a lot. And I was thanked. I was thanked by the patients for jumping in and saving everybody. Because sure enough, Solvay wasn't going to do that. And I couldn't afford to pay to keep the price of $1,000. So it ended up being a very, very expensive drug, but just enough to make money for me, just enough to make money for the company and the manufacturing, and just enough for the patients. And it ended up being kind of a happy story. So a really happy story. If you like, I took one of the families out to dinner and I took them to a WWE event. We all had a blast and said, you know, gee, if it wasn't for kind of the miracle of capitalism, nobody would ever make this drug. So in any event, you know, drug pricing is a really complicated area. And invariably, I find that the people who know a lot about drugs inevitably are the people that kind of understand where I'm coming from. And the people that have no clue about medicine, or especially people who are young and idealistic, maybe I'll be pejorative for a second and say your average Bernie supporter or somebody like that. Like, these are the people that don't understand it and think it's unconscionable and this and that. And it really defies reality if you think about it and just understand it. Now, it also happens to be a really easy media trope and media story and narrative. So I'm not surprised that folks in the media took it. That's their job, is to take the mundane and make it exciting. So my story is actually fairly mundane, but it can be made saucier and really interesting by sort of taking it and shifting the narrative and personifying it, right? Instead of it being Pfizer or Merck and a spokesperson contacted by Johnson & Johnson said that, no, you got it all wrong. No, it's this person that you can, you know, sort of fill them out. So as an individual and as a bad guy. So in any event, that's sort of my quick take on it. It gets so much more detailed and so much more interesting. But again, you have to be kind of interested in pharma and pricing and things like that to really understand it all.
That was a very detailed answer. And like I said, you did a much better job explaining that than I did the other day.
All right, so let's get some W's for the jury that convicted this loser, bro. Let's get some W's for the jury in chat.
Okay,
jury.
Don't yell into them. Just calm the fuck
All
down.
right, so let's get into this. So listen, my son. Here's the problem, right? The problem isn't that you have any good arguments about pharmaceuticals, because maybe you do. You're just a criminal, dude. You got convicted. The jury decided. The black Twitter has decided. The conservatives have decided. Everyone's decided this. So that you are now a jury of the public opinion, and the people have decided this. So whether you're right or wrong doesn't matter. We don't care. The facts don't matter here. The public has decided you're guilty, so you're guilty. Second point, I want to know, how many people do you think you killed as a result of what you did? Go ahead.
I would say, so I guess your first question wasn't a question, right? Just to be clear.
No, I'm just humiliating you. Go ahead, my son. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. And the second question is, I've actually saved thousands of lives over my career. How many have you saved?
I've debated Russia, Ukraine, and I've given money to the Russian armed forces. So I've saved many Russian lives against the Nazis in Ukraine. Yeah.
Okay. By donating, you saved somebody's life?
Yeah, I saved the Russian soldier's life. I probably paid for someone's armor and then protected him from some nationalists killing him. So,
how much money have you donated?
That's confidential information. I don't need a Fed to question me on how much money.
Right?
So don't Fed pose, dude. Listen, I know you want to nerd and monologue and bore the whole VC.
No, probably.
Nobody wanted this AMA, so we're going to now destroy you as a result of it.
Let's face facts. You're probably, what are you, 20 years old, if that? You sound very young.
Okay, thank you, Russian.
Yeah, I am.
Okay, thank you.
Is this indicative of your user base?
That's the we have a very, very diverse user base. By that I mean to say that we have a lot of retards. But we've got a lot of smart people too.
Okay,
I think
that wasn't one of them.
Yeah, not one of them.
The question was, what were your thoughts on prison rehabilitation, and have they changed since being or experiencing the system?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't think I had thoughts on it before, right? And that's the problem with prison in general. And I try to explain this to a lot of the guys in prison, is that nobody cares about prisoners. That's just not somebody. If you're a politician and you have a list of people to care about, the poor, the elderly, the sick, prisoners is not the first thing on your list. In fact, it's not even the top 10. You've got a lot of other people to worry about. Felons, people who have committed crimes. These are not the kind of people you really want to give more rights to or do anything nice for. And that sort of makes sense in one breath. But in another breath, it makes sense that you want to take the worst people in society, and I use the word worst loosely here, but let's argue for a second that they're the worst people in society. You want to do something about rehabilitating those people. You want to do something about helping them. And again, the problem becomes, well, why would I give resources to their kids who are homeless? There are people who need more educational services and healthcare services. Why give limited resources to people that have proven that they don't deserve it? And I think that's the thing you're fighting against when you're talking about prison reform, is that ultimately it comes down to money and resources. And what's the ROI? What's the benefit of helping somebody that has committed a crime 3 or 4 times? Because prisoners tend to be recidivists. If they don't learn from their first trip in prison, why should they get any resources? And I think it's a provocative question. I don't know the right answer. I'm not a sociologist or a politician. I don't necessarily know what the right policy is. I think we should experiment a little bit. And I think that's one of the things that is wrong with government and people refuse to sort of do. Experiments are not fun to engage in, but they can be really instructive. That's why most tech companies do something called A/B testing. Facebook will take, let's say, a new button design, and they'll give half the people the button design, and they'll give the other half the old button design. And if they'll sort of see if people like the new button design, and then they'll go with it if it makes sense. We don't do that because we like to mess around, or Facebook doesn't do that because they like to mess around with button design. They want to help people and give them the best product. We don't do that in government, and I think we should. I'll give you an example. The last questioner asked about my federal criminal case, and it was really interesting. I got to be in a federal courtroom. I got to see how a jury works and all this stuff. And I said, gosh, wouldn't it be better if we did it this way? And wouldn't it be better if we did it that way? And we don't experiment at all in the criminal justice system. Why are there 12 jurors? And why aren't there 6? Why aren't there 15? Why is it 12? Why did we come up with that? Why does the government get to go first? Psychologists have known for a long time that the first argument somebody makes usually is the argument that an audience will find to be the better argument, because they got to hear it first, especially if they hear it for 5 weeks, which is the case in my case. Sometimes a prosecutor's case can go on for months. And by the time it's the time to defend yourself, the jury's already made up its mind that you're guilty, because all they heard was all the evidence as to why you're guilty. You haven't gotten to put any evidence on that why you're innocent yet. You could have the complete alibi, and they don't hear it for months. So why don't we try the defense going first? I wonder if that would affect the guilt or innocence of something. So the point is, the lack of experimentation is really interesting, and we could probably experiment in prison reform too. I did a class in prison that got me a year off my sentence, and it was a really interesting class, and it was, I thought, really helpful. But we should do more things like that. In this class, you go through some pretty intensive training and deprogramming and all this stuff. I won't go into the class in too much detail, but the point is, there could be lots of experiments that we could do, if we gave prisoners iPads and forced them to take different, not forced, but strongly encourage them to take different university classes or something like that. Maybe we can give them time off prison, because a lot of people in prison, as you know, many prisoners are in for drug and gun crimes. And basically, they're prisoners that have no educational experience whatsoever. And maybe if they had more educational experience, they'd be, able to not recidivize and be able to go into a field where they could work instead of commit crime. And again, that's an experimental question. And the only way to answer an experimental question is by experimenting. And, it's something that we really just tend not to do in government. And I think that it's something we have to start embracing if we want to sort of make changes. But again, I think the greater point here is that we don't want to make changes. 100,000 or 150,000 felons, that's all there are in the federal prison system. So what do we care from the federal side? And on the state side, the numbers are somewhat similar in the sense that they're a lot more. There are 2 million state prisoners, but again, the states have to deal with that on their own. So I think, it's really a problem that is an inertia problem. I think people talk about prison reform and stuff like that, but it's not really a key issue for most people.
I was curious what changed in terms of how you view things economically, socially, before getting caught or before going to jail and in the time since. Because to me, it seems like it's unusual, right? I think you got more media attention than, you're not the only guy playing those games at the time, right? It's interesting to me that they were so hyper fixated on you, and then on top of that, it does seem like you've shifted a little bit in certain things. You're talking about prison reform. You're talking about some of these other issues. Do you think you've changed substantially in how you view things and how you view the world?
So as I get older, I'd say that, I just become less and less sure of myself. I think when I was 21, I was a real beast. I was a little bit like the guy that called me a minute ago, insufferable. And as I got older and older, I've become a little more mellow and open-minded and sort of, contemplative. I don't think I've changed that much. I mean, I'm still sort of a small government, libertarian type of person. One thing I've changed a lot on is, I'd say, race. So I've always sort of been pretty open-minded to this stuff, but more and more I do believe that there is something called systematic or systemic racism, which is something I kind of didn't believe in before.
Did that change kind of come through in prison?
It didn't.
Or is that just generally time? It's just been more and more you become more.
I'd say both, but certainly in prison helped crystallize it. Because remember, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I saw the effect, or I saw sort of. It's hard to put into words, but like I could see sort of what was going on. That there was this sort of, for especially for Black people, well, not beat around the bush, that there's sort of this prison pipeline, that is really alarming.
It's poverty, right? I'm sorry.
It's not just poverty. It really isn't just poverty. It's interesting. It's a mix of.
Of course.
It's certainly poverty that doesn't help at all. Poverty is a part and parcel of it. But I think part of it is culture too. And again, that's a hard thing to say, and most people aren't willing to say it. But I sort of blame a bit of culture too, and that means white culture, that means Black culture, that means a lot of things. And I think it takes time, so I do think that this problem will be solved and healed eventually. It's terribly tragic, of course, but it's fascinating to sort of see it up close and personal in prison, and to distill it into actual people you meet, right? It's easy to sort of look at a statistic, and this goes back to the pharma sort of story as well, is that statistics don't leave you with a personal feeling. Martin Shkreli leaves you with a personal feeling, right? Whereas, Pfizer's earnings went up 10% is not something you're going to react to. And the same thing here is that if you hear the statistic that 1 in 4 Black males will end up in prison, it's a startling statistic in and of itself.
That's what I was saying before, is why you fascinated, because I think you were latched onto, so your trial and incarceration, at the end of the day, white collar crime is ubiquitous, right? Like, and it's far more damaging than any amount, I think, of violent crime, like a increasing crime rate versus, economic recessions and economic downfall. It's night and day, right? Yet they were so fixated on you, which
I'm not sure I agree with what you're saying 100%. But one thing I think we could agree on is if a guy steals $1 million, he might go to jail for a couple years. If a Black guy robs a bank for $1 million, he's getting 25 or 30 years. Is that what you're trying to say, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, there's that. I think we prioritize violent crime because it's scary. I think when we think about these crimes, something like you did, for most guys who do, we don't really think about that. It doesn't trigger the same emotional response as hearing about a dude who's on the subway, cutting people, right?
And then maybe it shouldn't. I mean, I don't know that. I mean, our criminal justice system certainly punishes violent crime more than nonviolent crime, but I would imagine that's a consensus view, and your view is actually an outlier. I think most people want to punish violent crime more than nonviolent crime. I grew up in a community that was extremely diverse, virtually every race, every ethnicity in Enclave in Brooklyn. And what's interesting is that I left that for kind of more prosperous, place 2 miles away in Manhattan. The point is that, in prison, I sort of got to almost reconnect with maybe not the same people, but the same types of people that I knew in Brooklyn growing up that I avoided. I didn't want to be around necessarily those types of people. I knew kind of the kind of people I wanted to be around were people who were wealthy and smart and smart, or I should say educated maybe. That was kind of where I wanted to go. So going to prison was kind of like coming back to my origins, and something that I was deeply afraid of was being poor or being uneducated, and that just was ingrained in me from the start. And seeing it was really plaintive and difficult, not for me, because I knew that I'd go back to wealth and intellectual pursuits. The problem was, what do you do about the guy who's 40 years old, dropped out of high school, has a reading level of fourth grader, and doesn't have a whole lot to do other than at least to make a decent or honest living, or some people would use the word not humiliating.
Sustainable, the ability to at least pursue goals.
Right? Yeah, or just not menial. I think a lot of people find the the idea of like, well, yes, that person could be a janitor or a truck driver, but for a lot of people, I think the word is dignity that I'm looking for, that a lot of people feel like that's a job without dignity. And again, a crueler person might say, well, if that's the job you're qualified for, then that's all the job you're going to get. And that's a very Darwinian kind of like perspective. But, if you look at it from a humanistic perspective, this is a person that, obviously maybe they didn't have a good family figure, whether it's a father figure or a mother figure or either. They were misled, possibly basically indoctrinated by a gang or a culture that was really corrosive. And that person's, that early upbringing, which is so important, was just so absent and difficult that it ended up creating a monster of a person. It's not that person's fault, at the end of the day. Little kids aren't smart enough to determine if they're being misguided or not, right? And little kids who grow up in Yonkers or grow up in the Bronx or wherever, and they get, and I'm not saying that every single person that grew up in the Bronx ended up this way, because far be it. That's not true at all. There are plenty of billionaires and successful people from those places. But some of these people are more prone than others to be taken advantage of, to be indoctrinated for somebody else's benefit. For example, here's a gun, go shoot that guy. That's somebody else's benefit. And it's sort of taking advantage of that person for, and I met thousands of people like this. And some people understood it, some people didn't, some people wanted to fight it, some people didn't. But it's really something that I'm sort of, I hate to use the word awakened to, because I'm not a woke person, but I think the idea that like this does exist and denying it is sort of foolish.